Before I introduce the speakers, I first want to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever you're calling in from, you're on Indigenous land. At MOHAI, we're on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people who were forcefully removed, but whose endurance we honor with deep respect and gratitude for their stewardship of this place, both lands and waters. And we hope that as we think about preserving history and preserving buildings, we also think about preserving the stories of the Indigenous people who have lived here and who live in this city still. So now I would like to introduce our speakers for the evening. Thank you to all of them for coming out tonight to share their wonderful knowledge with us. So first, as Manish Chalana, who engages in urban planning through the lenses of urban design, historic preservation, equity, and social justice. He has degrees in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning. Currently, he teaches urban planning at the University of Washington and serves as a member of the Historic Preservation Advisory Committee of For Culture. We're also joined by Dana Phelan, who is the Preservation Program Director at For Culture, the cultural funding agency for King County. Dana's role includes managing historic preservation grant programs and providing assistance to preservation advocates and stewards of historic properties. Last but certainly not least, we'll be joined by Stephanie Johnson-Tolliver, who is president at the Black Heritage Society of Washington State, where she leads a dedicated board of directors who are committed to upholding the Society's mission to collect, preserve, and share the history of Black people from across the region. Stephanie is an advocate for the awareness and preservation of historic sites. Thank you all for joining us. And I look forward to hearing all that you have to share.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll get started. Thank you all for joining in this evening. We're very excited to share our work with the Beyond Integrity group, and Dana, Stephanie, and I will talk about that. But before that, let me just quickly visually describe myself. I'm a cisgendered South Asian male in my early 50s. I'm an immigrant from India. You can probably tell that from my accent. At this time, I'm sporting a longish, scruffy, salt and pepper beard with closely cropped hair. I wear glasses, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. So with that, I'll get started. Beyond Integrity is an open working group that focuses on equity and inclusion in historic preservation practice. We focus largely on King County. It was a group that was started in 2014, and it's convened by For Culture. Members are typically historic preservation professionals and advocates who are concerned about the underappreciation, neglect, and loss of cultural resources associated with non-white, non-cisgendered males and non-elite groups primarily. So it's a broad category. The goal of the group is to bring out systemic changes by identifying inequities in the current historic preservation practice and engage local decision makers in embracing new standards and foster stronger voices for advocacy around these topics throughout the region. Let me quickly define the terms, what we mean by equity, diversity, and inclusion. Equity is an approach that ensures that everyone has access to the same opportunities. It acknowledges that advantages and barriers exist, and not everyone starts from the same place. And it tries to address and correct these imbalances. Diversity, on the other hand, is the presence of differences within any given setting. Generally includes race and gender, class, ethnicity, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, age, and other non-visible diversities. Inclusion is about people with different identities who being valued and welcomed in any given setting. So inclusion is also very important and part of the triad. With this presentation, we will share with you the efforts of Beyond Integrity Group in furthering equity and inclusion in historic preservation practice. The image in the slide is a blackboard with this sign, "I heart this place because," which is followed by a fill in the blank. It's a signage created to solicit feedback about people's association and connections with different places, sort of seemingly ordinary places that may not reveal their significance in an outright manner. Next slide. So I begin by providing you some background on how the practice of historic preservation in United States has been shaped by white supremacy and colonial archaeology. The National Park Service, that, as you all know, is the manager of the bulk of cultural resources in the country. And it has historically undervalued and often outrightly erased cultural resources that are associated with non-white groups, especially those that fell within the confines of their newly created national parks in the early decade of the 20th century. So in the context of national parks, Native groups would be, put on display for the entertainment and consumption of mostly middle-class white visitors. The image on my left shows Hopi Indians putting on a show for visitors in 1896 when the railroads were built and early tourism infrastructure was laid out in Grand Canyon. This is even before Grand Canyon National Park was created. So this practice was already ongoing where Native groups were putting on shows for visitors. And once the parks were created, the Native groups were dispossessed from their ancestral homelands, and then they would be invited back to put on shows for the entertainment of the visitors. So colonial archaeology and practices, continues to inform the National Park Service's work, despite a lot of progress, including creation of the traditional cultural properties, which are called the TCP properties, which allow Native groups to carry out their traditional cultural practices with those sites and with minimal interference from the National Park Service. So there's a lot of progress that has happened. But despite all that, the feds seem to unwittingly or not so unwittingly further the myth of Native cultures as dead and buried, as opposed to living and alive and around, to justify the broader manifest destiny narrative. And this type of sort of interpretive practices seeped into private historic properties as well. On the right, you see a slide from Williamsburg, Virginia, which, as you know, is a living history museum managed by a private foundation. It was a recreated colonial town in the 1930s with support from Rockefeller, and it has misrepresented non-white histories for the longest time, particularly the Black experience, notably around slavery. In reality, the town, a colonial town such as Williamsburg, would have had a population of African Americans in excess of 50%, contributing to all aspects of town life. However, in the recreated town, in its recreation, Blacks were mostly seen as carriage drivers plying white tourists, as shown in the slide, in the image on my right. Additionally, the centrality of slavery in any colonial town, including Williamsburg, and the brutality of the institution of slavery weren't engaged in any meaningful way until recently. So at this time, most historic sites showcased and interpreted and grandized white histories at the cost of all, white male histories at the cost of all groups, including women. Next slide, please. So the National Park Service first began to take stock of their misrepresentation of American history through their efforts in 1992. This was the 25th year anniversary of the passage of the Historic Preservation Law in 1966. And also it coincided with the 75 years of the creation of the National Park Service in 1916 through the passage of the Organic Act. So since then, there have been significant efforts from the National Park Service to further equity and diversity at all levels of professional practice. So they've, created several context studies for different cultural groups, including Latinos, Asians, Blacks, and others. In the picture on the left is a journal cover of their journal titled Cultural Resource Management from 1992, and it had several pieces on cultural diversity and historic preservation. The agency acknowledged the benefit of diversity in historic preservation, noting the rapidly changing demographics of the country as revealed in the 1990 census, which for the first time pointed that US was going to be a majority minority country in the subsequent decades. So they were taking stock of the changing demographics of the country. Also, 1960s, as you know, is recognized for civil rights progress and postmodern thought that emphasized the notion of cultural relativism and new social history. So historic preservation began responding to these cultural shifts by expanding their interpretive efforts beyond the traditional CART driven by a Black coachman, right, to include more complex histories. In this slide, you see, however, there continues to be a diversity deficit, largely as a result of the colonial framing of historic preservation. Laws, policies, criteria that favor sites that showcase high style architecture and histories of cisgendered upper class white males at the cost of all groups, including communities of color, lower income groups, and women. And because of this, a lot of places and people are left out in shaping history and memory of this country. So what gets left out is, all modest, architecturally ordinary sites that are usually associated with non-elite groups. You can see the quote by Ned Kaufman, who is really arguing for the importance of ordinary buildings for history and memory, and especially for those associated with marginalized groups. So in this slide, you see a picture of, to my left, of Harbison sisters, Kitty and Annie, with friends who homesteaded in the Grand Lake area that would eventually become part of the Rocky Mountain National Park. They successfully ran a dude ranch. After the park was created, it erased their homestead and naturalized the site. That image is on your right. And now it interprets the elk habitat from their side. So it's such a lost opportunity of women entrepreneurship and their stories tied with the frontier. Next slide, please. So our group wanted to explore why such disparities continue to haunt historic preservation practice despite much progress. So the word integrity and beyond integrity phrasing refers to the heavy importance and value placed on architectural fabric in historic preservation practice. And evaluations of potential landmarks is still very much tethered in the celebration of the high style, well-maintained buildings associated with prominent architects, notable architecture style, construction materials, and such, rather than telling a complete story of the American people. So our group defined, largely the underrepresented communities. We defined them as non-white communities of color, women, LGBTQI groups, working classes, tied in with labor histories, and other groups, including low-income, homeless, veterans, and other marginalized communities. So it's a rather large group that we considered as underrepresented communities for the purposes of our work. Next slide, please. So very quickly, the Seattle landmark designation process is, the designation process has 4 steps: nomination, designation, controls and incentives, and designating ordinance. I'm going to just quickly cover the first 2 in the interest of time, the nomination and designation. The nomination, it requires, designation requires the building, object, or site to be at least 25 years, and it must meet one of the 6 criteria for designation as outlined in the Seattle Landmarks Preservation Ordinances. And these are, the significant, the site's association with historic events, that's 1. Site's association with significant person, that is 2. 3, its association with cultural, political, or economic heritage of the city, community, state, or nation. 4, whether or not it embodies distinct, visible characteristics of an architecture style, or a period, or a method of construction. 5, whether or not it's an outstanding work of a designer or builder. And 6, does it have a prominent spatial location, contrasts of siting, age, and scale, and is easily identified in its neighborhood context. So it's distinct that way. And in addition to meeting at least one of the 6 criteria, the site must also possess historic integrity, which is essentially the ability of the site to convey its historic significance. And historic integrity is generally determined based on 7 criteria. 1 is location, 2nd is setting, 3rd is design, 4th is materials, 5th is workmanship, 6th is feeling, and 7th is association. As you can tell, 5 of these are linked with the brick and mortar, the built form of the property. And for a site to be determined to have historic integrity, it must possess several of these 7 criteria for it to be considered as retaining historic integrity. So you can see it's still closely tied in with the fabric, not with social history. And that's what our group was trying to sort of, challenge. Can we move on to the next slide, please? The Beyond Integrity group facilitated the review of landmark nominations and designation reports to understand the level of association of these with underrepresented groups. And we created the following categories to organize our data. And Dana is going to talk more about that, but we created a scale from 0 to 3, where L0 has pretty much no mention of association with underrepresented communities. L1 has a minimal mention, but that is not central to the property's historic significance. L2, we categorized L2 as including properties in which underrepresented groups association is noted and described adequately, but not fully fleshed out. So there's more can happen there. And L3 is the best case scenario, where the narrative that is included is rich and has a detailed description of properties association with underrepresented groups. Next slide, please. I'll give you a quick rundown of what these categories will look like, and Dana will talk more about these. So in L0, you would find properties like the one that you see in the slide, that of the Redmond Hotel, which was built in 1889, also known as Justice White's house, and recognized for its association with William White. William White was a Washington State Supreme Court justice, but he also fought in the Civil War. But White was rarely at this site. His wife, Emma McRedmond, actually ran a hotel on this site, and after White died, she continued to run it on the hotel on her own. So the report barely mentions Emma McRedmond. We see that as a lost opportunity to interpret women's history particularly around entrepreneurship and resilience against adversity. It's a story of empowerment. The slide here shows Emma McRedmond on the left, a black and white imagery of Emma McRedmond. She's wearing a turtleneck gown with her hair pulled up in a bun. And on the right is a contemporary image of Redmond Hotel, which is a two-story structure with gable roof and clear story windows. Next slide, please. In L1, you would find sites like the Coleman School, which is located in the Central District, which is a historically Black neighborhood in Seattle, or at least was until gentrification started happening in the last 2 decades. This property was designated in 2005, but the report does not fully engage the civil rights history so central to this site. The nomination has 5 pages devoted to architectural description and talks extensively about alterations to the building. But any references associated with school boycott in 1966, there was a boycott that was protesting segregation, is not mentioned in the report. There are only 3 sentences related to the 8-year occupation of the building by 4 African-American activists demanding that the school be repurposed as an African-American heritage museum. And ultimately it was in 2008, so their efforts were successful. So our work through the Beyond Integrity internship was to expand on the social and cultural history of the school, especially its role in school integration and equity, and also the occupation by the activists from 1985 to 1933, which is said to be the longest act of civil disobedience in the country. So we were expanding, this nomination. On the slide, there are 2 images. There's a newspaper clipping on my left, which is an article from, I believe, Seattle Times, talking about ending school and segregation, probably from the 60s. And the image on my right is a black and white photograph of the Coleman School from 1940s. It's a ground plus 2 building with gable roof. Next slide, please. L2 contains nomination and designation reports that include adequate description of the association of the site with minority groups. And I include the example of Eastern Hotel here, which is one of the earliest buildings in Seattle's International District, going back to the early 1900s. It's an example of a single row occupancy hotel, which were common in International District, with the retail spaces along the main and alley facades. It was designated as a landmark in 1978. The building was also placed on the National Register of Historic Places as part of the Seattle Chinatown Historic District in 1986. It has since been rehabbed into 40+ affordable units for low-income residents. The nomination report adequately describes the hotel as an anchor building in the neighborhood and explains its association with the Asian communities. However, it does not nuance the different Asian groups, particularly the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos association with the building. And more generally, does not sort of tease apart its significance for labor history, so there's room for some more description in it, but it does a decent job in providing information that we think is adequate in explaining the underrepresented community association. The slide is a contemporary image of the hotel, which is a masonry structure with ground plus 3 structure. There is retail on the ground floor with a Black Lives Matter imagery on the facade of one of the retail stores. Next slide, please. Since I'm running out of time, I'll just wrap up quickly. L3 is the best case scenario. These are examples that fully flesh out the association of underrepresented minority groups with the site. Garfield High is a good example of that. The report describes not just its built structure, which, as you can see, is a 3-story structure with elaborate terracotta details in Jacobean style, and that's what is shown in the slide. But the school is also recognized for its ethnic and racial diversity. Many students from many different races attended the school. It's recognized for fostering the value of community, and the students do a lot of murals and work for the community. So the nomination is one that covers all, including information about the illustrious alums of the school, including Quincy Jones and Jimi Hendrix. Next slide, please. And I'll wrap up my section with what I call Lminus. It's not really an official category, but these are sites that haven't yet received any nomination or designation. Since they haven't received a nomination, they obviously could not receive a designation, and they remain vulnerable to transformation and erasure. So on the slide is you see the Black Panthers headquarters. It is their first location on 34th Avenue. As you know, the mission of the Black Panther Society was to further raise up the African American community and establish a different political, social, and economic order, right? Its members were protesting police brutality, which, as we all know, continues to be a commonplace in African American communities. So the slide has 3 images. The one on my left is the Black Panthers headquarters, which is a nondescript 1-story storefront, now a wine shop in Madrona. And on the right are historic imagery of the Black Panther Society demonstrating. There's one where the Panthers are protesting in front of the federal courthouse in Seattle in 1969, which is at the bottom. And the top right is a cover of the magazine called Seattle, in which the Black Panther member is in a police car, sort of signaling, joining police to serve the Black community. So I want to wrap up by saying many such sites, as you see in the L- categories, which are nondescript buildings, have a rich social history that haven't even been considered for landmarking. And we want to sort of try to change that, because we feel that these sites have powerful social history, and that social history should triumph high style architecture and historic integrity, which continues to be a defining feature for any designation and nomination process. And I'm sorry, I may have exceeded my time. I'm done. Thank you.
You're okay, Manish. Thanks. And I will take it from here. I'm Dana Phelan again. I work for For Culture, and before my time at For Culture actually is when Beyond Integrity was first convened, but I've been really glad to join the group and help to facilitate it over the last few years. I'll describe myself, and before I jump into my set of slides, I'm a white woman. I'm wearing a headset right now and glasses. I have curly brown hair that's pulled back into a ponytail, and I'm wearing a gray shirt and sitting in my basement with a blurred background. I'm going to be sharing more information about the internships that Manish described, that were really the core strategy that we used with Beyond Integrity to gather a lot of data about existing landmarks, and to start to understand what the current situation is in terms of how representative those landmarks are, whether things were sort of, as we maybe expected them to be among the members of Beyond Integrity in terms of what was represented in designated landmarks. So to that end, Beyond Integrity, with financial support from Far Culture, has hosted a series of internships. They started in 2016, and the goal of the internships was to first gather data on designated landmarks. So in 2016, our intern Jialing Liu gathered information on 139 landmarks in King County and 359 specifically in Seattle. So Manish talked about the designation process for Seattle specifically. We also gathered data for landmarks outside of the city, including ones like the Redmond Hotel. There's a little bit different process and criteria in terms of how those are designated, but there's also a lot in common because, as Manish mentioned, a lot of the those standards and criteria kind of trickle down from National Park Service standards and federal standards for historic preservation. So that was the first stage, was gathering data on already designated landmarks. Then in 2017, we had a second intern, Kirsten Freeman, who gathered data on why nominations were rejected. So nominations that went before specifically the Seattle Landmark Preservation Board and were considered for designation, but rejected between the years of 2008 and 2015. And that was looking at 101 properties total that, again, were considered for nomination, but didn't make it all the way through the process. So this next slide summarizes the results of the research from those first two internships. We're using the same scale that Manish talked about, where you have everything from no mention of an underrepresented community at L0 up to L3, where there's a really strong description of an underrepresented community and why that's significant. And so there's a pie chart shown on this slide, and this is for landmarks in King County outside of Seattle, showing that about 50% of the nominations for those properties did not mention an underrepresented community at all. Only 9% had an underrepresented community described as a really important part of the significance of that property. So that's King County. Next slide is focused on Seattle specifically. And so this is Seattle landmarks that were designated between 1974 and 2015. Of those, 72% made no mention of an underrepresented community. Only about 5% had a really strong description of a connection to an underrepresented community. So again, a principal finding from this research was that of places connected with underrepresented communities were a really small percentage of designated landmarks locally, especially relative to those communities' representation in the population. So next, looking at properties that were considered for nomination in Seattle, but were not designated, we found that we were able to compare the designated properties to those that were not designated between 2008 and 2015, and found that Seattle properties with a strong documented link to underrepresented communities were, so that's in the L2 or L3 category, were 25% of the non-designated properties, but only 14% of the designated properties. And in reviewing minutes from Seattle Landmarks Board meetings, our intern found that architectural integrity, which Manish talked about as required for landmark designation, that integrity was the most common factor in the Landmarks Preservation Board voting against nomination or designation. And in addition, architectural significance was often emphasized in those discussions. over and above cultural significance of places, even when a property had potentially both architectural and architectural significance. In 2018, we had a third intern, Stephanie Barrera, and she took a closer look at the data on Seattle landmarks to really break down within that collection of landmarks that did have that documented strong association to underrepresented communities, what were actually the demographics that were represented there. And she found that really most of those properties, the underrepresented communities that were described in detail, had to do with labor or low income communities and women. And that actually the properties that were associated with communities of color or LGBTQ communities was a very small number of the designated landmarks. In fact, we found that LGBTQ, Native American and Latinx communities are largely absent from the documentation of designated landmarks. It's not always clear if those associations were not being researched or included in the nominations, or if the properties that are associated with these communities are not being nominated at all. But I think we also, we kind of understood from our work too that in a lot of cases, we do think they're just not being nominated because it's not necessarily what is initially identified as significant about places. Our work has also focused on where there are opportunities to change and really see some of the more systemic change that we're hoping for in the field. And so some of that work has involved case studies. Manish talked already about the Redmond Hotel. Our Stephanie focused her work on doing research to tell a more complete story of that property. And in fact, in the years since then, the King County Historic Preservation Program was awarded some grant funding by the state to officially expand the landmark nomination and also work on revisions to several other existing landmarks within the county to tell more inclusive stories. So the picture you're seeing on the left is again that same image of the Redmond Hotel. On the right, you're seeing an image of Yasamura Shed, and this is to illustrate another approach that we think is important for expanding what's identified and designated as landmarks. So our 2019 intern, Tara Williams, focused especially on survey and inventory methods. That is, how do we identify potentially significant historic places in the first place? So she looked at a couple of different examples of surveys. First, at survey methods that started with a visual overview of a geographic area and a kind of general historic context, and found that there, in those kinds of approaches to surveys to identify historic places, it's very easy to completely miss the cultural significance of a site. And in her case study, she actually specifically focused on the building that was shown on the, I think some of the promotional information about tonight's program, as well as the first slide, is known as the Vogue or Vane building, which was not identified as significant in a survey of downtown Seattle buildings, but was for many decades a counterculture hub, and was also the venue of Nirvana's first Seattle show, which to Tara, I think was an especially significant thing. She also looked at survey and inventory methods that focused on starting with a specific cultural community, and then went from there to identify historic places rather than starting with sort of a visual overview. She looked at a study of Japanese American history and places in the White River Valley, And that's where this image of Yasuma's shed comes in. And this is actually not the original building on the site, but this was the location of a departure point of the Japanese American community from the White River Valley. The packing shed that was here originally was used as an informal train station to send Japanese Americans to internment camps during World War II. And while the original building is not there, there's the form of the building that is there and the landscape around it, and including what was the railroad line is still very evident. And so this is the kind of place that it would be very easy to overlook as having historic significance, but clearly is a really meaningful place for that community. So I also just wanted to finish sharing these findings. And as Manish said, at the beginning, one of the main goals for the Beyond Integrity group has been to engage with decision makers in the field, to share our findings, and to advocate for more equitable practices. And so we've worked closely throughout with City of Seattle and King County Historic Preservation staff, and their collaboration has been essential in helping gather all of this data about landmark nominations and designations. We've shared the data we've gathered back with them, and they've been really interested in those findings. That actually led to the opportunity to present these findings to the Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board in 2018, and to have a really direct dialogue about where we go from here. Local and statewide historic preservation and heritage organizations and the State Historic Preservation Office have also been really engaged and supportive of this work. Last year, one of the founding members of Beyond Integrity, and the person who actually coined the name Beyond Integrity, for which we're very grateful, her name is Kennedy Whiters, and she hosted a virtual conference that allowed us to really share some of this information with others who are doing similar work locally in other locations around the country. That was a great opportunity, and that was an event that was sponsored by For Culture, but also had sponsorship from Historic Seattle and the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. So as we move forward with this work as Beyond Integrity, and all of the kind of members of this group do our work individually as well, we know that there have been significant changes in the historic preservation field in recent years, both at the local level, and lots of changes and similar discussions happening nationwide. And so we're looking to continue to update the data that we have. So the data that I presented earlier was up through 2015, but we'd like to really update that for the past 7 years and understand better whether and how things have been shifting, and where we still need to make more improvements and change. And also continue on the work to really, that last piece that Manish mentioned as a goal, to strengthen the voices of advocates and encourage advocacy for important culturally and significant places from here. And so with that, I want to pass it on to Stephanie to talk a little bit more about her work, about the Black Heritage Society, including the challenges that communities still face in sort of navigating historic preservation processes, but also the work and successes and plans for the next year and coming years.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Rachel, first of all, thank you for that introduction you gave earlier. For me, I am Stephanie Johnson Tolliver. I'm president of the Black Heritage Society of Washington State. I'm coming to you from my living room. I am a African-American woman wearing glasses, shoulder length, natural hair, and a long black sleeve shirt with a gray and white scarf around my neck. Dana and Manish, you know, thank you for the invitation this evening to join you. And every time I listen to you, I'm learning something new, right? The conversation tonight that touches the Black community and other communities who are sadly underrepresented when we look at the heritage sites that tell the unique contributions and the stories that represent the legacies within our neighborhoods. It is pretty sad and evident when we look at those pie charts, right? I mean, that's a great visual. Dana, you shared the data, and it showed the disproportionate, designations. You shared the guidelines that are the structure by which the nominations are reviewed. And we know that current designations are not a full representation of the history that was and is vital to Seattle and our region. The full story is what enriches our lives and affords us this opportunity to appreciate how deeply rooted and diversely rich our local history is in contributing to the national story. So at BHS, we've maintained this extraordinary archive of Black people's lives from across the region, dating back to the 1880s and to current day. This was our 1977 founding mission with Esther Mumford and Jacqueline Lawson. And I think that what we do is with our collections, this is the workhorse of our organization, right? We pay full attention to sustaining the archive. However, in the past 6 to 7 years, we've been looking outside the archive to be better advocates for heritage sites. We've been lending our voice in one way or another to support several current nominations, and some of them with some success. And I know I saw Ryan Donaldson, I think he's here with us tonight, who was instrumental in bringing the Horace and Susie Caton House forward. There's Tolliver Temple, that is a beautiful old synagogue that is now a Black church in central Seattle. And then in Tacoma, the Nettie Asbury House, very important nomination and designation. So as organizations, and particularly at BHS, we, like, well, many other organizations, are concerned about the heritage sites that tell our stories and how they're vanishing. We ask questions about the process and found that if we are not at the preservation table, making the nominations, presenting the historic data that goes to the significance of places, they are either not presented for nomination or don't make the grade based on enough historical content. Or sadly, the guidelines, because these guidelines put emphasis on architectural integrity over cultural significance, sometimes it's not always visible or tangible, these places. And Manish said earlier, and I jotted down a little note when he was talking about integrity and evaluating, property integrity. I mean, who decides what's significant, right? Your advocacy, all of our advocacy helps to determine what is significant. At BHS, we always encourage the community to be the history keepers. That's the one thing that we always do. And in our diverse communities, the stories, are the fabric of our lives. We're bound to the sites that do not possess architectural significance all the time. So for the past couple years, and you see this really beautiful slide of the People's Wall. It is a mural wall that was painted by Dion Anderson in 1970. It's at the location of the second headquarters of the Seattle chapter Black Panther Party. The home was raised in about 1973 or 4, I believe. So the wall is the only remaining artifact or piece or recognition of the second headquarters of the Seattle chapter legacy. So for the past couple of years, BHS, we've been moving an effort, and I say couple of years because we throw in a little bit of a setback, but we've had this effort to nominate 2 heritage sites that are associated with the legacy of the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party. We've learned a lot along the way, and we cherish and regard most of all the community engagement and the property owner support. It's difficult, in our opinion, to move forward without, the support of community and the homeowners or property owners. I do know that in Seattle, and Dana or Manish, you can correct me, but I believe if you bring a Seattle nomination forward, you do not necessarily require the owner's buy-in. Although, that is something that is a part of BHS. We always want the owners to be fully participatory in a nomination or landmark designation. There have been, again, I mentioned a few setbacks, but we've been really encouraged by the willingness by the preservation professionals and organizations who want to invest in our success, to build our skill, to join the movement for saving places. So to join this movement, and it's all about telling the full story. On May 19th at 5:30, Historic Seattle will host an online program, Saving the People's Wall, that shares more about our shared interest in saving places. So Elmer Dixon, who was a co-founder of the Seattle chapter Black Panther Party, is among those who joined me on that evening. But, I did mention the investment from the organizations that are so supportive, and I'm talking about Beyond Integrity, Historic Seattle, the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Department of Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. I mean, these are groups that have really rallied around and supported our efforts. So I would encourage anyone to reach out to any of these groups if you have questions, and then of course to our Seattle Landmarks Board. They're absolutely fabulous too. So with all of that said, I think that we have some time for some questions and answers, and so let's do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all 3 of our speakers. We can't hear the audience, but let's give a virtual round of applause out there. And there's still room for questions. So if you have any, feel free to either put it in the chat in the Q&A, and I will make sure that they get asked. Wow, I feel like I'm still taking it all in. I'm so appreciative of everything that the 3 of you in various ways are working on and advocating. I feel like the scale of how big the problem is, just seeing those pie charts with how many of the designations are in that L1 category was really striking to me. I feel like it's something that had a sense for, but seeing it laid out like that is different. I'm curious, where how do you feel that the field is supportive of your efforts? Like, do you feel like this is something that other historic preservationists are getting behind in Seattle, or what's the larger conversation about needing to move the framing, needing to move it, or is it something where it's still really having to be an advocate and push for it, and that maybe not everyone who's doing this work understands the necessity yet?
I guess I can jump in and others can answer too from their perspectives, but I think there's a couple of level of challenges. I think that there's a very supportive professional preservation community among the organizations and local historic preservation staff, definitely recognizing these issues and pushing for change. There's also been, Manish mentioned some of the work on theme studies done by the National Park Service. And I talked about those sort of culturally specific surveys that can be really helpful with identifying important places. And I think there's been support for that and some good work happening at the state level to identify places. They've actually received a series of National Park Service underrepresented communities grants to do different work on specific communities. They've done a couple of focused on Latino heritage sites. They're working on one on Filipino heritage sites. And so that's great, but it definitely at the local level will also take additional investment in survey and inventory and support for organizations like the Black Heritage Society that are doing this work and can help move it forward. And I think that's one of the things that would be great to see is just that additional work to identify and nominate places proactively. And that definitely takes time. And I think part of the challenge is you're looking at, like in those pie charts, you're looking at 1974 to 2015. And it's like the collective sort of data from that whole stretch. And so sort of changing that balance is not going to happen overnight, but it's going to take a really sustained effort in order to kind of shift some of those numbers and start to see some change in what we have as officially recognized as a landmark. I also should say, like, landmarking it has been the focus of what Beyond Integrity works on, but it's not the only way to save places either. So there's also really good work that has happened outside of the landmarking process to save culturally important places.
Thank you.
Just adding to that, right? In the academy, there's been a discussion on equity and inclusion in historic preservation practice for over 2 decades, with scholars coming up with important insights, revealing insights as to what is happening in terms of just how many properties that are listed on the National Register, which is the repository of historical record in the country, how the bulk of that stock is associated with white groups, primarily white males. Yet, the field has continues to remain stubbornly Eurocentric, and And this is not due to the potential, shortage of potentially eligible properties for other groups. I think it's because the framework of historic preservation is rooted in white supremacy, and which covertly legitimizes white claims to the nation's heritage at cost of other groups. So it's a deep foundation that efforts like ours are only going to start denting it. But the entire sort of the framing has to be shifted, and spaces would have to be created so that the image on the slide that you see of the People's Wall would be appreciated and documented and preserved for posterity. But that's not happening at this point. So that's sort of a pessimistic read on it, because the academicians have been talking about it, its importance and value for a very long time, but there's been a disconnect between theory and practice, and continues to hold, even though we are sort of, the gap is closing in, but it's still pretty wide. So.
Thank you. I appreciate you naming that it's not a new conversation, that academics have been talking about it, and that it takes so long for it to catch up, to be put into practice. I think that's a good reminder. And that, I know that even outside of the academy, these conversations are not new either, but I'm glad that it is catching on, even if still a lot more to be done. And on the topic of how people can be involved, we do have a question from one of our viewers on how someone looking to help a neighborhood effort how can someone looking to help a neighborhood effort, what can someone do basically to be helpful if there's somebody trying to get a historic landmark preserved? How can they be part of that effort? The question.
I'll jump in really quickly and say that, first of all, if you're interested in a particular site, I know one of the things that I've done in the past is I've gone to the landmarks for the website, and I look to see what's listed there and what's pending, because it's possible that the site you're interested in could be pending, and maybe you decide to join that group and be an advocate for that site. Secondly, ask in the community heritage groups and organizations. Often there's somebody there in the community or a neighbor who has their finger on the pulse. So you got to get out and just do, your own community engagement around that. And if not, begin your own campaign. Anyone can bring a nomination before the board. So I know that's could be a little daunting, but that's where you have organizations like, Historic Seattle and others that can help you through the process. And often you'll find online webinars or sessions that help you through the various steps or sequence of steps on how to get a nomination to move forward.
I'll put in a plug for culture funding too, to help with if a nomination seems like the right path. We have grant funding that can support landmark nominations, and love to see grant applications from either informal or established community groups that are advocates for a particular place in their community. And yeah, as Stephanie said, anyone can nominate a property as a landmark. You don't have to have owner consent within the city of Seattle, although it is great too. It's not necessarily a fun experience to have a contentious landmark nomination go before the board. So yeah, but I think all of Stephanie's recommendations for connecting with community are a great place to start.
Thank you. Oh, this is a great question. So there seems to be tension between preservationists and pro-density advocates. Have you met with any pushback from people seeking greater density in Seattle? I think the thought of, do we need to tear down the older buildings so that we can build bigger, higher, more densely packed apartments is my guess. Is what this question was getting at.
Right, I'll take a shot at it. I think it's a sort of it doesn't have to be like that. This is the the pro-density and preservationists are put on they shouldn't have to argue with each other, because there are ways to achieve density and preserve history and memory. They're not mutually exclusive in my mind. And I think sometimes there is misinformation, and a lot of information is lost. We have tools like transfer of development rights, where you can sell air rights, for buildings that are historically significant that have to be maintained. So you could sell the air rights, and those air rights can be transferred to receiving sites. So there are tools around that. So they don't really have to be at loggerheads with each other. But oftentimes they are, especially in urban settings, where the pressures of development are sometimes excessive. So I haven't had much of a personal experience with that, so I'll defer to other members on the panel if they can share with us their insights.
No, I think your insights are exactly right, Manish.
I do too, and I think that often it goes to neighborhood character too, and what we know is that we have design review boards and committees in our neighborhoods, and sometimes it's when you talk about contentious, people show up and express opinions about development in their communities, but it's one way to express yourself about density in your neighborhood or community, is to show up at the design review board.
And as preservationists, we of course, appreciate and value sustainability and all the efforts around sustainability, and would like density to be part of the equation. But at the same time, we would not want to compromise on history and memory, especially sites that are important to the community. And I don't think, like I said, they have to be mutually exclusive. It's just that sometimes for developers' vested interest, they like sort of positioning us as these crazy people standing in front of bulldozers, to preserve any old building. But that's really not the case. Because preservation, as Kevin Lynch said in the 1960s, it's about managing change. We're not anti-change. We're totally not it. We're not wanting to freeze everything and pickle everything. We just want to have change that is respectful of the past and also the future. So that's really what our agenda and goals are through our work.
That's such a wonderful way of putting it. And I think it seems like so many things, the answer is there needs to be more nuance in the conversation, that it's so easy and politically expedient sometimes to form clear divisions where it's not that clear. There's a connected question, which is looking at gentrification and historic preservation, and what can the role of socially oriented historic preservation be in resisting gentrification? And or is that part of resisting gentrification? to preserve certain spaces?
Resisting gentrification. Our communities are evolving. You know, I've had my own personal experiences in my community where it started out as me being mad, then me trying to figure out, you know, how to be part of the change. And once I figured out how to be part of the change, the train had left the station, that was the most important thing that you can do. So again, to Manish and not wanting to pickle, I love that, pickling. But, you know, looking at how our communities are evolving and be a part of that and instrumental in the change.
I mean, following up on what Stephanie said, change is something is a natural part of the urban experience. We, you know, even if we wanted, we cannot sort of keep things frozen in time. But at the same time, gentrification can be problematic because it's often quite disruptive and a violent process, especially for low-income communities, you know, who lose their rented apartments and are thrown out, and they're oftentimes people of color and low-income groups, and the years of association and social equity and capital that they're built in the neighborhood is lost rather quickly. So it's very disruptive to the ways of lives and livelihoods. And I think historic preservationists do not take much responsibility for that, because, you know, they say that, you know, it's the market that is determining all that, and we're doing our job. We're working on preserving the history of the buildings and through our controls and programs, and then people buy into that. People like it and they want to buy into that neighborhood character, so there's more pressure and demand. I don't know, I struggle with that, looking at what's happening in the Central District, which is over the decades been increasingly less and less Black and more white, right? And so, and that was anytime I see that is the only neighborhood in the entire Seattle metro area from which the history of African American community can be interpreted. There's nothing else like that, right? And yet we don't have enough systems in place to even carve out pieces of the neighborhood where that history can reveal itself, and people who are interested in it can learn about it. And that's largely because of gentrification and the market and the demands and all that economic stuff that I don't fully understand that's happening. And it's rather unfortunate. I don't think as preservationists we can take the entire blame, but we really need to be cognizant of that and be thinking about how our work might further that, and what are the policies and programs that we can put in place ahead of our work so that gentrification can at least slow down, if not be fully controlled. So.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to see issues of gentrification and displacement. I think it's those questions are really tied to these questions about cultural significance of places and the meaning of places too, because if a place is significant really for its use over time, right now we don't have many good mechanisms within the regulation of historic preservation that can maintain the use of a place over time. So I think I do think about that with culturally significant places that might achieve landmark designation, but then that designation protects a building, but it doesn't protect the use that makes it important. And so I think that in those cases to have really meaningful preservation take place, I think finding more ways to encourage, a continuing cultural use or that continuing cultural tie to a place can be really important as well. And I just see that as connected with the questions about gentrification too, because I think there's an aspect of preservation where it's very focused again on the architectural significance, physical integrity, and then if the use changes, it doesn't matter as much perhaps as if it's a cultural significance. And then when the use changes, yeah, that can really kind of destroy the meaning of the place.
Mhm. I like the idea of, reuse with some of our historic landmarks, those that have already been landmarked. And in the Central District, again, mentioning the Central District, at Fire Station 6, at 23rd and Yesler, how that fire station now is in the hands of Africa Town. And they're bringing a technology center there that is just kitty corner to the Douglas Truth Library. And look at all of that great energy that's going to happen there, on that corner and utilizing the old Fire Station 6. So I think we can think about, opportunities like that as well.
That's a great point of what does the use bring to it, but then also how can the reuse still benefit the community, even if it's not the original use, and sometimes maybe even benefit more than the original use. Wow, such a good discussion. Another question, this is a little bit going a little back to more to why things are the way they are and wondering about the lack of historical designations. And the question is, how much is that lack of historical designations among historically oppressed communities due to poorly constructed or maintained buildings? That the conditions in which buildings were built and the level of economic wealth in the community led to things being able to arrive at the present moment in a certain condition or not, which then makes it more likely to be nominated.
I mean, the question is just hitting the nail, right? This is what we're talking about, that the system is set up in a way that sites associated with non-elite groups who did not have access to architects or, top quality materials, and oftentimes were self-built, are less likely to retain their historic integrity as determined by the criteria, right? Because they would have also gone through adaptations and changes. If there was the family expanded, they would add another room and so on and so forth. But I think that kind of layering adds to the history, not takes away from the property. But our system is not set up to appreciate that. It sort of, you take the example of Liberty Bank on 23rd and Union, which was, which came up for designation, but failed designation because even though it looked very much like it did in the 1960s, much of the discussion was hinged around, the changes to the facade and the windows and all these sort of mundane things, instead of talking about the rich social history of the bank and how it provided as the only, how it provided access to, capital for African Americans in Central District, who then became homeowners and middle class, and and then it brought about so much changes in the society, being open to people of color. And so there was a rich history in the bank, but because its condition was not well maintained, we lost it. We lost it, and losing it we lost all opportunities to interpret that history from the site, even though Africa Town and the development that replaced it has done a reasonably good job in keeping the memory of the bank as well as providing affordable housing. So some good has come out of that site, but not all sites have been that fortunate. So yes, I mean, it's a vicious cycle. Non-elite people do not produce sturdy buildings, or did not produce sturdy buildings that could stand the test of the time, and they are more likely to have changed over time and quote unquote lost their integrity, and hence not a part of the historical record. And that's happening even as we speak.
Just kind of want to sit with that for a moment. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Are there any last calls to action any of you want to let our audience know of ways that they can help carry this work forward?
I think that we've touched on a lot of ways to get engaged and to reach out and get out in community. I think that if you hear about a property in your neighborhood or your community, it goes to the character of your community. It defines your sense of place in the community. Then again, be that history keeper, be that person. It starts with you and can end with you. So those would be my final words to everyone who has interest in a property or nominating or bringing a property forward.
Yeah, I think that's great. I can't really say more than that, except that there's lots of people and resources here to support you too. So, reach out to those groups as well.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for all three of you for coming and speaking. I feel like I'm gonna have to rewatch this to think about these things more. Luckily, we did record it, so it will be on our YouTube page. And for those of you watching, if anyone missed it, we'll be sending out the link to you afterwards in a couple of days. And thank you so much also to our friends at HistoryLink for being part of this wonderful monthly series. We're so happy to be able to put on talks like this with you. So thank you. Thank you, Kiku, for coming back on there. And now we would love to invite you to our program next month, which is going to be with Felix Bunnell talking about the democratizing power of radio and the place that radio is played in our community's history. So tune in next month. Oh, sorry, actually, big reminder or announcement. We're going back in person next month, but we're going to be live streaming. So there will be a way to tune in. So you can choose, you can either come to MOHAI and we will be in person, or it will be live streamed, I believe, through Facebook, but there's going to be more details on our website. If you're confused and it's coming up on History Cafe time and you don't know where to find us, just email programs@mohai.org and we will get it sorted, or check our website for more information. But we hope to see some of your faces in person because we have definitely missed that. And also, we would love if you'd help us answer some questions about the program. We really value your feedback as we try to bring you the best in regional history programming. And it'll only take about 4 minutes to complete. We also have a prize. We will be taking and putting everybody's name who completes the survey and doing a raffle draw once every 3 months. So the more you come to our programs and take the survey, the more likely you'll get a prize. So please check that out. The link, I believe, will be posted in the chat. And finally, if you enjoy our work, learn something new, please consider making a gift or becoming a member to support future programs and help sustain the museum beyond the impact of our pandemic closure. We appreciate it so much. And also a huge thank you, not to forget you, to our captioner, Sue. Thank you to both of our ASL interpreters, Erin and Mary. We just really appreciate all you do to help us make these programs more accessible. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. And we hope to see you in person next month. Have a lovely evening.